Mom-in-law, my husband promised I could live in your house. Fernanda's words echoed in my living room like a hammer hitting glass. There she stood at the entrance with two enormous suitcases and that arrogant smile I knew so well. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid slide down my throat as I stared at her. The silence stretched for seconds that felt like an eternity. Finally, I set my mug down on the table with a soft clink and replied in the calmest voice I could muster. "That's odd, Fernanda. I sold the house to a couple last Monday." Her face changed, as if she'd received an invisible slap. The suitcases dropped from her hands with a dull thud against the floor. Mark, my own son, stood frozen in the doorway, mouth agape, eyes wide. It was as if I'd detonated a silent bomb right in the middle of my own living room. I'm Evelyn, 71 years old, and for decades, I was the woman who always said yes, the one who lent money with no return dates, who cooked for 30 people on Thanksgiving, who stayed silent when I was disrespected. But that day, seeing Fernanda with her suitcases and her proprietorial attitude, something inside me broke forever. "It can't be true," Fernanda muttered, her voice trembling between disbelief and rage. "Mark assured me this house would be ours. He said you'd already agreed to us moving in." I slowly rose from the armchair, feeling every one of my years in my knees, but with a dignity I hadn't felt in a long time. "Mark may have promised many things, dear, but this house was mine, and I decided what to do with it." The family gathering we'd planned to celebrate my youngest grandson, Leo's birthday, had turned into a theatrical scene I would never forget. Fernanda began pacing circles around the living room, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the floor. Her hands moved through the air as if she were conducting an invisible orchestra of indignation. "This has to be a cruel joke," she shrieked, pointing an accusing finger at me. "You can't have sold the house without consulting us. We were counting on this. We had plans. I'd already given up my apartment." Mark finally found his voice, though it sounded like that of a frightened child. "Mom, is what you're saying true? You really sold the house?" I looked at both of them, these two people who had assumed they could dispose of my life and my decisions as if I were an old woman with no will of my own. The aroma of coffee still steaming in my cup mingled with Fernanda's overly sweet perfume and the scent of desperation emanating from Mark. "Yes, son. I signed the papers on Tuesday and received the first payment of $50,000 on Wednesday. The new owner's move is scheduled for next Friday." My voice sounded strangely serene, as if I were commenting on the weather. Fernanda collapsed onto the sofa, her legs trembling so much she couldn't stand. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness, but of pure frustration. "You can't do this to us, Evelyn. You know perfectly well we need a place to live. My nurse's salary isn't enough to pay for decent rent, and with current prices—" "And what about my need to decide about my own life?" I interrupted, feeling the words flow from a very deep place within me. "When was the last time you asked me what I wanted? When was the last time you considered my feelings?" Mark approached and sat on the edge of the coffee table, leaning so close I could see the lines of worry etched around his eyes. "Mom, I understand you're upset, but this is very drastic. We could have talked, found a solution that worked for everyone." I laughed, a dry laugh that surprised even myself. "Talk? Like when we talked about the $1,000 loan I gave you 2 years ago that you never repaid? Or like when we talked about Fernanda using my credit card for her emergency purchases that turned into $5,000 a month in expenses?" The silence that followed was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. Fernanda stopped crying and looked at me with a mixture of surprise and something that seemed like respect for the first time in years. The expression on Fernanda's face shifted from surprise to something much more dangerous, pure calculation. I knew that look. It was the same one she got when she needed something and was assessing exactly which buttons to push to get it. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and straightened her shoulders, transforming in seconds from victim to strategist. Evelyn, I don't think you're thinking clearly, she said with that sweet, condescending voice she had perfected over the years. Perhaps age is playing tricks on you. It's not normal for a person to make such important decisions without consulting their family. Mark nodded immediately like a well-trained puppet. Mom, Fernanda's right. This isn't like you. You've always been so considerate of us. I stared at them, feeling as if I were watching a poorly acted play where the protagonists had forgotten their original lines. Considerate. I had been considerate? I let the question hang in the air as memories began to flow like an unstoppable waterfall. I remembered that March afternoon, 3 years ago, when Fernanda came to my house crying because the electricity had been cut off in her apartment. It's only $400, Mom-in-law, she had said, using that diminutive that she knew melted my heart. I promise I'll pay you back next month. I never saw that money again. But I did see a week later how she arrived with a new green dress that cost more than the electricity bill I had paid. I remembered the Thanksgivings where I'd get up at 5 in the morning to cook the turkey, prepare the mashed potatoes, bake the pies, and decorate the entire house while they arrived at 2 in the afternoon empty-handed, expecting everything to be perfect. We know you love doing it, Mom, Mark would say every time I hinted that maybe they could help. Nobody cooks like you. I remembered the birthdays where I bought the gifts, organized the parties, and cleaned up afterward, while Fernanda paraded around as the perfect hostess, receiving all the praise for events I had entirely planned and financed. You know what isn't like me, Mark? I said to him, rising again and walking toward the bookcase where I kept all my important documents. What isn't like me is having allowed myself to be treated like a money and favor dispenser for so many years. I pulled out a brown folder containing all the receipts, all the checks, all the bills I had paid for them over the last decade. I let it drop onto the coffee table with a dry thud that made the coffee cup jump. Here's the $2,500 hospital bill I paid when Fernanda broke her ankle skiing. Here's the $12,200 car insurance receipt I paid when Mark had his accident. And here, I held up a yellowed paper, is the $8,000 promissory note you signed when I lent you money for the down payment on Fernanda's car. Fernanda had turned pale, but her voice maintained that false sweetness. But Mom-in-law, we always thought that was good, that it was normal among family. You have more resources than us, and you've always been so generous. Generous. The word left my mouth like a whip. Generous or foolish? Because there's a very big difference between giving out of love and being systematically taken advantage of. Mark stood up abruptly, his cheeks reddened by something that might have been shame or anger. Mom, you're being very unfair. We never asked you for anything you couldn't give, and we've always been grateful. Grateful! I laughed again. That laugh I was discovering had a strange power to cut conversations short. Like when Fernanda told her friends in my own kitchen that I was a bitter old woman who didn't know how to have fun. Or like when you told David that you wished I'd understand that times had changed, and I couldn't expect children to take care of their parents anymore. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. This one had weight, texture. It was the silence of truths finally coming to light after years buried under layers of false politeness and unilateral sacrifices. Fernanda was the first to try to break it. I never said that exactly. You said exactly that, Fernanda. I was standing behind the bathroom door and heard every word. I also heard when you said you hoped I'd soon understand that this house was too big for one person and that it would be perfect for a young family like yours. Mark's eyes darted quickly between his wife and me, as if he were watching an emotional tennis match where he didn't know which side to root for. Listen, Mom, he finally said. Maybe we've made mistakes, but selling the house like that, suddenly, without telling us anything, that's wrong too. This is the house where I grew up. All my childhood memories are here. I walked to the wall where the family photos hung. Pictures of young Mark playing in the yard, birthday photos, Christmases, graduations, all taken in this house, in these very corners where the end of a story that had lasted too long was now unfolding. You're right, son. All your childhood memories are here. But tell me, when was the last time you came to visit me just because you wanted to spend time with me? When was the last time you called me without needing something? Mark opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes filled with a painful understanding that came too late. Fernanda, seeing that the emotional strategy wasn't working, changed tactics. Okay, Evelyn, I understand you're upset, but we can still fix this. You can cancel the sale. Surely there's a grace period. I'm not canceling anything, I said, with a firmness that surprised even myself. The new owners are an adorable young couple, Lily and Ben, who are expecting their first baby. They're going to fill this house with real love, not calculations and manipulations. Fernanda's face finally hardened, the mask she had worn for years dropping away. Fine, Evelyn. If you want to be a selfish old woman, go ahead, but don't expect us to keep coming to visit you when you're alone and realize the mistake you made. Fernanda's words hung in the air like a thinly veiled threat, disguised as a warning. But instead of feeling the fear or desperation she hoped to provoke, I felt something completely different. Relief. A relief so profound that for a moment I thought I might faint from the intensity of the sensation. You know what, Fernanda? I said, walking slowly toward where she was sitting. That threat you just made is exactly the confirmation I needed, that I made the right decision. I sat in my favorite armchair, the same one where I had made thousands of decisions over the years, but none as liberating as this. For years I've wondered if you really loved me, or if you just wanted what I could give you. You just answered that question. Mark ran his hands through his hair, that nervous gesture he'd had since he was a child, when he knew he'd done something wrong. Mom, Fernanda's upset. She doesn't mean it. Oh yes, she does mean it, son. And you know what's the saddest part of all this? That you won't contradict her. You'll nod your head and follow her orders, as you have for the past 8 years of your marriage. Fernanda stood up abruptly, her heels clicking an aggressive rhythm against the floor. I'm not going to stand here listening to a resentful old woman insult us. Mark, let's go. Clearly your mother has lost her mind. But Mark didn't move immediately. He stood there, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. It was as if he were seeing for the first time the woman who had raised him, who had worked double shifts to pay for his college, who had been there for every fall, every triumph, every important moment of his life. Mom, he said, his voice broken, do you really think we only come for money? The question hurt more than I expected, because it was accompanied by a small spark of the sincerity that had disappeared from our conversations long ago. For a moment, the 35-year-old man in front of me was again the 7-year-old boy who asked me if the monsters under the bed were real. I don't want to think that, Mark. But what else can I think when in the last 2 years you've only called me when you needed something? When the only time you visit me is when Fernanda needs me to babysit, or when there's a bill to pay, or when you want me to cook for your parties. I got up and walked to the sideboard where I kept all the birthday and Mother's Day cards I had received over the years. I took them all out and spread them on the table. Look, son, here are all the cards you've given me in the last 5 years. Do you know what they have in common? They were all bought by Fernanda. I know because I recognize her handwriting. You didn't even take 5 minutes to write your own name on the Mother's Day card. Mark approached the table and looked at the cards. His face slowly crumbled as he recognized the evidence of his own emotional neglect. And you know what else? I continued, feeling years of contained pain finally finding their voice. 3 months ago, when I got the flu and was in bed for a week, who came to see me? My neighbor, Naomi. Who brought me homemade soup? Naomi. Who made sure I had medicine? Naomi, a woman who owes me nothing, who isn't my family, but who behaved more like a daughter that week than you have in the last 2 years. Fernanda, who had been waiting by the door with her suitcases, returned to the conversation like a missile seeking its target. Very nice speech, Evelyn, but the reality is that you need us more than we need you. Who's going to be there when you're 80 and can't even get out of bed? Your neighbor Naomi? Her words were like daggers aimed directly at my deepest fears. the fear of old age, of dependence, of loneliness. For years I had tolerated their behavior precisely because of that fear. Better to have toxic family than no family at all. But something had changed in me in these last few days. Perhaps it had been the conversation with Lily and Ben, the young couple who bought my house, when I saw in their eyes the kind of genuine love I had forgotten existed. Or perhaps it had been the talk with Naomi when she told me something I couldn't get out of my head. Evelyn, true love is not bought with money or maintained with sacrifices. It is given freely and received in the same way. You know what, Fernanda? I replied, feeling my voice gain a strength I didn't know it had. I prefer to grow old surrounded by people who love me for who I am, not for what I can give them. I prefer to have one genuine Naomi than 10 fake relatives. Mark finally found something resembling a backbone. Fernanda, maybe we should... His wife interrupted him with a harshness that surprised even me. We are not going to beg an ungrateful old woman, Mark, after everything we've done for her. Everything you've done for me? Disbelief made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years. Please, enlighten me. Tell me exactly what you've done for me that I haven't paid for, or that hasn't benefited you more than me. The silence that followed was deafening. Fernanda opened and closed her mouth several times, like a fish out of water, searching for examples that didn't exist. Mark tried to fill the void. Mom, we've always been here when you needed us. When have you needed me, son? My voice softened because this question didn't come from anger, but from a very deep sadness. Give me just one example of a time in recent years where you've been there for me, not to ask me for something, but just to be there. I watched as Mark desperately searched his memory, and the pain on his face told me everything I needed to know. He couldn't find a single example. Fernanda, seeing that the conversation wasn't going her way, played her final card. Fine, Evelyn, you win. But when you sell that house and spend all the money, and when you're living alone in some miserable apartment for old people, don't come crying to us asking for help. Don't worry, Fernanda, I replied with a smile that surprised me with how genuine it felt. I have no intention of bothering you ever again. I took Fernanda's suitcases and gently placed them outside the front door. I think it's time for you to go. The new owners are coming tomorrow to measure for curtains, and I wouldn't want this tense atmosphere to make them feel uncomfortable in their new home. The expression on Fernanda's face when I put her suitcases outside the door was a perfect mixture of shock and fury. I had never before seen anyone go from calculated manipulation to pure rage so quickly. Her cheeks flushed a deep red, and for a moment I thought she might explode right there in my entryway. "You're kicking us out?" she demanded in a voice so shrill that the neighbors 3 houses down probably heard her. "You're kicking us out of your own home after all we've meant to you." "I'm not kicking you out," I replied, with a calmness that surprised even myself. "I'm simply being clear that this conversation is over. You've expressed your feelings. I've expressed mine, and I think we all know exactly where we stand." Mark approached me with glistening eyes, and for a moment, I feared he was going to cry. "Mom, please. I know we've made mistakes, but we're family. Family doesn't abandon each other like this." His words hit me straight in the heart because for so many years I had believed exactly that family was sacred, that blood was thicker than water, that no matter how much they hurt you, you always had to forgive because they were family. "You're right, Mark," I told him, gently touching his cheek as I used to do when he was little. "Family doesn't abandon each other, but it also doesn't exploit, manipulate, or take for granted." I moved away from him and walked to the window overlooking the backyard, where I had planted roses 20 years ago. The same roses I had cared for religiously, pruned every season, protected from the cold every winter. Some had bloomed beautifully year after year. Others had never produced a single flower, despite all my care. "Do you know what I learned from tending my garden, son?" I asked him without turning around. "That you can give a plant all the love, all the water, all the nutrients in the world. But if that plant is sick at the root, it will never blossom. And there comes a time when you have to make the difficult decision to pull it out so the healthy plants can grow. When I turned around, I saw that Mark had paled. He perfectly understood the metaphor. Fernanda, however, had gone from shock to strategic victimhood. She dramatically slumped against the doorframe, hand clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. "I can't believe how cruel you're being, Evelyn," she said in a trembling voice. "After all these years of loving you like a mother, of bringing you your grandchildren to enjoy, of including you in all our celebrations." "Including me?" The word came out of my mouth with more force than I intended. Including me as the unpaid servant who cooked, cleaned, and financed those celebrations? Including me as the free babysitter who watched the kids every time you wanted to go out? Including me as the personal bank that never charged interest and never demanded payments? I walked to the bookcase and pulled out another folder, this one filled with photos. Photos of birthdays, parties, family gatherings. In every one of them, I appeared serving, cooking, cleaning, or holding the children while others enjoyed themselves. "Look at these photos, Fernanda. In this one, I'm serving cake at your son's birthday while you pose for selfies. In this one, I'm washing dishes on Christmas Eve while you and Mark watch television. And in this one," I held up a particularly painful photo, "I'm standing alone in the kitchen preparing Thanksgiving dinner while you're in the living room laughing with your friends." Mark came closer and looked at the photos. His expression gradually shifted from confusion to understanding, and then to something that dangerously resembled shame. "Mom, I hadn't realized." "Exactly, son. You hadn't realized, because for you it was natural for me to be there, always available, always willing, always picking up the tab. It became so normal that you stopped seeing it." Fernanda, seeing that she was losing ground, changed strategy once more. "Okay, I admit that maybe we haven't been grateful enough, but that can change. We can do things differently from now on. You don't need to sell the house to send us a message." I looked at her for a long moment, studying her face. There was something almost desperate in her eyes now, a vulnerability I had never seen before. For the first time in years, she was realizing that she might actually lose access to her source of financial security. "Fernanda," I said softly, "have you ever asked me how I am? Have you ever asked me if I feel lonely? If anything hurts? If I'm afraid of anything? Have you ever asked what dreams I have that I haven't fulfilled? What places I want to visit? What things I want to do before it's too late?" Her silence was answer enough. "Because I have asked myself those things about you. I know Mark wants to change jobs but is afraid. I know you dream of opening your own clinic. I know the kids need braces and that you've been putting it off for money. I've worried about your problems. I've lost sleep thinking about how to help you." I walked to the table where I had left the house sale documents. I picked up one of the papers and showed it to Mark. "Do you know how much money I received for the house, son? $250,000. A considerable sum for a woman my age. And do you know what I was thinking when I signed those papers? I was thinking of using part of that money to help you with the down payment on your own house, to pay for the kids' braces, to help Fernanda with her clinic." I saw both their eyes light up with hope, and it pained me to have to continue. But then I realized something. I realized that if I died tomorrow, you wouldn't cry for Evelyn, the woman who loved you unconditionally. You would cry for Evelyn, the source of easy money that had just disappeared. Mark slumped onto the sofa as if he had been hit. "Mom, that's not true." "It is, son." "Then explain to me why in the last 6 months, every time you've called me, it's been to ask me for something. Explain to me why Fernanda never calls me to ask how I am, only to let me know when she needs me to babysit the kids." Fernanda finally found her voice. "Evelyn, maybe we're not perfect, but we're not the monsters you're portraying either. We make mistakes like everyone else. Mistakes are made once, Fernanda. This has been a pattern for years, and the saddest thing is that I don't think you even realize what you've been doing." I sat in my armchair and looked at both of them. Mark had his head in his hands, and Fernanda was crying silently. For the first time in a long time, her tears seemed genuine. "I want you to understand something," I told them in the gentlest voice I could find. "This isn't revenge. It's not a punishment. This is self-preservation. It's a 71-year-old woman finally saying, 'Enough,' before it's too late to regain her dignity." The sound of the doorbell interrupted the moment. Through the window, I could see Naomi's car parked in the driveway. "That must be Naomi," I said, getting up. I asked her to come because I knew this conversation was going to be difficult, and I wanted to have someone close by who genuinely cares about me. When I opened the door, Naomi looked at me with those kind eyes that had been my refuge during so many lonely afternoons. At 68, she still had that vital energy that had taught me that age was just a number when the heart stayed young. She carried a tray of homemade cookies and a thermos of freshly brewed coffee. "How are you doing, dear?" she asked me softly, glancing discreetly toward where Mark and Fernanda were still in the living room. "Do you need me to stay? Or would you prefer I come back later?" "Stay, please," I replied, taking her free hand. "I think it's important for them to hear what a true friendship sounds like." We entered the living room together. The difference in the atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Naomi radiated a genuine warmth that contrasted dramatically with the tension Mark and Fernanda had brought into my home. "Good morning," Naomi greeted my visitors courteously, placing the tray on the dining table. "I'm Naomi, Evelyn's neighbor." Mark automatically stood up, still retaining the manners I had taught him as a child. "Nice to meet you. I'm Mark, Mom's son." Fernanda barely mumbled a greeting, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Her eyes assessed Naomi from head to toe, as if trying to decipher what threat this older woman posed to her plans. "Evelyn told me about selling the house," Naomi said, as she poured coffee for everyone, even for Mark and Fernanda, without anyone asking her. How exciting it must be to start a new chapter at 71. The naturalness with which Naomi spoke about my decision as something positive and exciting, instead of the tragedy Mark and Fernanda wanted to portray, completely changed the energy of the room. "You knew about this?" Fernanda asked with an accusatory tone that made me ashamed of my daughter-in-law's rudeness. Naomi smiled with that infinite patience she had developed raising 6 children of her own. "Evelyn and I have talked many times about her plans for the future. When you live as long as we have, you learn that life is too short to waste it on situations that don't nourish your soul." She sat next to me on the small sofa and automatically adjusted the cushion behind my back, a gesture so natural and considerate that it filled my eyes with tears. It was the kind of small but significant attention I hadn't received from my own family in years. "Besides," Naomi continued, "Evelyn has been so excited planning her new apartment. She already told you about the place she found near downtown. It has a beautiful view of the park and is 2 blocks from that bookstore she loves so much." Mark frowned. "What apartment? Mom, you hadn't told us anything about moving somewhere else." The disbelief in his voice was almost comical. He really expected that after selling my house, I would be living on the street. "Why would I tell you?" I replied, accepting the cup of coffee Naomi offered me. "In recent years, the only information about my life that has interested you is how much money I have available for your emergencies." Naomi nodded understandingly. "It's funny how sometimes the people who should know us best are the ones who know the least about our true feelings and desires." Fernanda couldn't contain her irritation. "Excuse me, ma'am, but this is a family matter. I don't think it's appropriate for you to—" "You, Fernanda!" I interrupted her with a firmness that surprised me. "Naomi has shown more genuine interest in my well-being in the last 2 years than you have in the last 8. If anyone is inappropriate in this conversation, it's certainly not her." Naomi placed a gentle hand on my arm. "It's okay, Evelyn. I understand emotions are running high." But there was something about Naomi's presence that was revealing contrasts I hadn't fully noticed myself. The way she automatically made sure everyone had coffee. The way she had brought homemade cookies simply because she knew it was going to be a difficult day for me. The care with which she had asked about my well-being before entering. "You know what?" I said to Mark and Fernanda. "I want you to observe something. Naomi arrived here 10 minutes ago. In that time, she made sure we all had something to drink. She brought homemade food to share, adjusted my cushion to make me more comfortable, and asked me how I was feeling. That's 10 minutes. You've been here an hour, and all you've done is demand, manipulate, and threaten. The silence that followed was interrupted by Naomi, who with her usual wisdom decided to share something that would completely change the perspective of the conversation. "You know," she said, taking a cookie from the tray, "my youngest daughter did something similar to me a few years ago. She assumed that because I was her mother, she had an automatic right to my house, my money, my time. She got furious when I decided to move to a smaller apartment and use the money from the sale to travel." Mark straightened up, clearly interested in hearing about someone else who had gone through a similar situation. "What happened?" he asked. At first there was a lot of drama, tears, reproaches, threats of never speaking to me again. But you know what I discovered? That when I finally set clear boundaries, when I stopped being the mom who always said yes to everything, our relationship actually improved. Fernanda scoffed dismissively. "That's very different. We genuinely need help. We're not capricious." Naomi looked at her with an expression that managed to be both understanding and firmly direct. "Dear, we all need help at some point in our lives. The difference lies in how we ask for that help and what we are willing to give in return. Love is not a commercial transaction where one party always gives and the other always receives." She stood up and walked to the photos I had spread on the table. She examined them carefully, one by one. "Do you know what I see in these photos?" she finally asked. "I see a woman who has spent years trying to buy love with acts of service, and I see a family that got so used to receiving that they forgot how to give." Mark approached to see the photos from a new perspective. "I never realized that you're always working in these photos." "Because for you, it was invisible," Naomi explained gently. "When something becomes routine, we stop seeing it as the gift it truly is." Fernanda crossed her arms defensively. "We've always told her thank you." "Thank you," Naomi repeated as if savoring the word. "Do you know the difference between real gratitude and automatic courtesy? Real gratitude is accompanied by reciprocity. It's accompanied by the question, 'What can I do for you?'" She turned to me with a warm smile. "For example, when Evelyn helped me last month with my groceries when I hurt my back, I didn't just say thank you. I invited her to dinner the following weekend, brought her flowers from my garden, and made sure to ask her how I could return the favor." The simplicity and obviousness of what Naomi was describing made the absence of those gestures in my relationship with Mark and Fernanda even more painful. "That's exactly what you've been missing," I told them. "You've not only forgotten how to give, you've forgotten that giving is a natural part of love." Mark ran his hands over his face as if waking from a very long dream. "Mom, I think you're right. I don't know when it all became so one-sided." "It became one-sided," Naomi replied softly, "when we allowed roles to harden instead of evolving, when Evelyn became the one who always gives, and you became the ones who always receive, instead of simply being a family that cares for each other." Fernanda finally spoke, but her voice had lost all its previous aggression. "So, what are we supposed to do now? How do we fix this?" Fernanda's question hung in the air like a fragile opportunity that could break with the wrong move. For the first time in the entire conversation, there was a genuine vulnerability in her voice that reminded me of the young nurse Mark had brought home 8 years ago, nervous but hopeful of being accepted into the family. Naomi sat down again, but this time she chose the chair between the sofa where I was and where Mark and Fernanda had settled, like a human bridge between two worlds that had been separated for too long. "The correct question, dear," Naomi told Fernanda with a gentleness she didn't deserve but needed, "isn't how to fix this. The question is whether you really want to build something new and different." Mark leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "What do you mean by something new?" "What you had before was broken," Naomi explained, pouring more coffee for everyone. Trying to fix it would be like putting duct tape on a pipe that's been leaking for years. Eventually, it's going to break again. What you need is to build a completely new relationship with new rules, new expectations, and new mutual understanding. I watched my son as he processed these words. I could see in his face that same intense thought process he had as a teenager, when he faced problems that required solutions he hadn't considered before. "Mom," he finally said, "if we could start over, if we could build something different, would you be willing to try?" The question hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had dreamed of hearing exactly those words, but now that they were in front of me, I realized that my answer was more complicated than I had imagined. "Mark," I replied slowly, "that's a beautiful question. But before I can answer it, I need to know if you truly understand what building something new would entail." Fernanda straightened in her seat. "What would it entail?" "It would entail," Naomi said, anticipating my thoughts, "that you would have to give up the idea of Evelyn as your financial safety net. It would entail learning to relate to her as a complete person, not as a role that exists to serve you." I took a deep breath before continuing. "It would entail that when you call me, it's because you want to talk to me, not because you need something. It would entail that when you come to visit me, you come to spend time with me, not for me to cook for you or babysit the kids." Mark nodded slowly. "I understand that, Mom, but I also need to ask you something. If we build this new relationship, does it mean we can never ask you for help again? That if we have a real emergency, we can't come to you?" The question was fair, and I was glad he asked it. It meant he was thinking about this seriously, not just saying what he thought I wanted to hear. "There's a huge difference," I explained, "between a real emergency and turning someone into your primary financial plan. There's a difference between asking for occasional help and expecting it to always be available. And there's an especially big difference between asking for help and demanding it as if it were a right." Naomi nodded and added, "In a healthy relationship, when someone helps you, your first reaction is to ask how you can return the favor, not when you can ask for the next help." Fernanda had been quiet during this exchange, but finally she spoke. "Evelyn, I know I've made mistakes, big mistakes, but I need you to understand something. It was never my intention to make you feel used or unappreciated." Her words had a different tone now. It wasn't the calculated manipulation from before, nor the aggressive defensiveness. She sounded like someone who was truly reflecting on her behavior for the first time. "I grew up in a family where we never had much money," she continued. "When I met Mark and saw how generous you were, I think I got lost in that security. I became so accustomed to knowing you'd be there to help us that I stopped seeing everything you were sacrificing to do it." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the front yard. From there, I could see the new owners, Lily and Ben, measuring the space where they wanted to plant a tree. Seeing them filled me with a strange warmth, as if I were seeing the future of my house in good hands. "Fernanda," I said without turning around, "I appreciate you acknowledging that, but I need you to understand that the problem wasn't just money. The problem was that I became invisible as a person." I turned to face both of them. "Do you know that last month I turned 71? Do you know that it was the first time in decades that I spent my birthday completely alone? Mark, you sent me a text message at 11 at night saying, 'Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry I didn't call earlier. It was a very busy day.'" I saw Mark physically shrink as he remembered that day. "And Fernanda," I continued, "you didn't even remember it was my birthday until 3 days later, when you needed me to babysit the kids, and Mark reminded you that you had forgotten to congratulate me." The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. This one was laden with a painful understanding that was finally taking real shape in their minds. Naomi stood up and came to stand next to me at the window. "Do you know what I did on Evelyn's birthday?" she asked without turning to look at them. "I arrived at 8 in the morning with a homemade cake and flowers from my garden. We spent the whole day watching old movies and telling each other stories about our children when they were little. It was one of the most beautiful days I've had in a long time." Mark stood up abruptly and walked toward where we were. "Mom, I didn't know you had spent your birthday alone. If you had told me, if I had told you, son, I interrupted him. If I had told you that I felt lonely, if I had told you that I needed my only son to remember my birthday without me having to remind him, those aren't things a mother should have to ask for. Fernanda came closer, with genuine tears in her eyes. Evelyn, I don't know what to say. I have no excuse for having forgotten your birthday. I don't need excuses, I replied. I need you to understand that these aren't isolated incidents, they're patterns. They're evidence that at some point I stopped being a real person to you and became a resource. Naomi put a hand on my shoulder. But you also need to understand, she said to Mark and Fernanda, that Evelyn isn't sharing this to punish you. She's sharing it because she wants you to understand what needs to change if you're going to try to build something new. Mark ran his hands through his hair again. Mom, if we decide to do this, if we decide to try to build a new relationship, how would we know where to start? The question made me smile for the first time in the entire conversation. It was the right question, asked in the right way, at the right time. You would start, I told him, by learning to know me as a person, not as a mother. You would start by asking me what I like to do, what dreams I have, what scares me, what excites me. You would start by treating me as you would treat a dear friend you want to know better. Fernanda nodded slowly. And we could ask you those things. We could start now. The genuine vulnerability in her voice touched me deeply. For the first time in years, I felt as if I were seeing the real person behind all the layers of manipulation and defense. You can ask me anything you want, I replied, but you have to be prepared to hear answers you might not expect. Fernanda sat on the edge of the sofa, as if preparing for a conversation she had been avoiding for years. Her hands trembled slightly as she settled in, and I could see that she was genuinely struggling with how to begin. Evelyn, she finally said, I want to ask you something, but I'm afraid of the answer. Ask, I replied, sitting down myself. At this point, I think we all deserve complete honesty. Have you ever really loved us? Or have we always just been an obligation to you? The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. It was exactly the opposite question I had been asking myself about them for years. Oh, Fernanda, I sighed, feeling my eyes fill with tears. Of course I've loved you. I've loved you so much that I lost myself in that love. The problem was never a lack of love. It was an excess of misguided love. Mark came closer and sat on the floor in front of me, as he used to do when he was a child and wanted to have a serious conversation. What do you mean by misguided? I mean that I confused loving with serving. I confused caring with sacrificing myself until I disappeared. I thought that if I didn't give you everything you asked for, I wasn't a good mother. I wasn't a good mother-in-law. Naomi nodded understandingly from her chair. It's something many women of our generation learned, that our value was in how much we could give, not in who we were as people. Exactly, I continued. Every time you had a problem, I felt it was my responsibility to fix it. Every time you needed money, I felt it was my duty to give it to you. Every time you needed help, I felt it was selfish if I wasn't immediately available. Fernanda wiped the tears that had begun to roll down her cheeks. But we never asked you to be perfect all the time. You didn't ask with words, I explained, but you expected it with actions. When I couldn't help immediately, there were long faces, comments about how difficult your situation was, indirect remarks about other mothers who were always there for their children. Mark lowered his head. Mom, I didn't realize I was doing that. Son, I want to tell you about a specific day that changed something in me forever, I said, taking a deep breath. It was 6 months ago. Fernanda had asked me to babysit the kids because you had an important dinner for Mark's work. I had been feeling ill all week, but I didn't want to tell you because I knew how important that dinner was. Fernanda straightened up, as if she knew exactly what day I was talking about. I spent the whole afternoon taking care of the kids while I had a fever. I helped them with their homework, prepared their dinner, bathed them, read them bedtime stories. When you returned at 11 at night, I was so sick I could barely stand. Mark frowned. Why didn't you tell us you were sick?" "Because when you arrived, the first thing Fernanda did was complain that the house was messy. The second thing she did was ask me if I had vacuumed the carpet. The third thing was to comment that the children had dark circles under their eyes and that I had probably let them watch too much television." Fernanda's face completely crumbled. "Oh my God, Evelyn, You didn't say thank you once that night," I continued. "Mark, you went straight to watch television. Fernanda, you started reorganizing the kitchen as if I had done everything wrong. I went home that night with a 104-degree fever, feeling like I had failed as a grandmother and a mother-in-law." Naomi stood up and came to sit next to me, taking my hand. "That was the night you called me crying." "Yes," I admitted. "That was the night Naomi came to my house at midnight with medicine and soup and stayed taking care of me until the fever went down." Mark looked genuinely devastated. "Mom, I didn't know. If I had known you were sick, but that's the problem, son. You shouldn't have needed to know I was sick to treat me with basic consideration and gratitude." Fernanda stood up abruptly and began pacing back and forth across the living room. "I can't believe how awful we've been. I can't believe I didn't realize." "Fernanda," I interrupted her gently, "sit down. I don't need you to punish yourself. I need you to understand." She sat down, but her breathing was agitated. "How can you be so calm about this? If I were you, I would have yelled at us years ago." "Because yelling wouldn't have changed anything," I explained. "It would have just been noise. What I needed was action. I needed to change the dynamic, not just express my frustration." Naomi nodded. "Evelyn spent a long time processing these feelings before deciding to sell the house. It wasn't an impulsive or vengeful decision." "Exactly," I confirmed. "It was a carefully thought-out decision after months of reflection. After realizing that if I didn't change something drastically, I was going to spend the rest of my life feeling invisible in my own family." Mark got up from the floor and sat in the chair in front of me. "Mom, I want to ask you something specific. If we decide to try to build this new relationship, what would you need to see from us to know that something has truly changed?" The question was intelligent and practical. I took a moment to think before answering. "I would need to see that you can spend time with me without needing anything. I would need to receive phone calls that start with, 'How are you?' instead of, 'I need you to.' I would need to see that you are genuinely interested in my life, my opinions, my feelings." "What else?" Fernanda asked. "I would need to see reciprocity. If I help you with something, I would need to see that you look for ways to help me too, not necessarily with money, but with time, attention, consideration." Naomi smiled. "Like when my daughter started bringing me flowers every time she came to visit me after we had our difficult conversation." "Exactly," I confirmed. "Gestures that show you think of me when I'm not in front of you, that you value my well-being not just when you need it for your own plans." Mark nodded slowly. "That makes sense. And what about financial boundaries? How would we handle that in this new relationship?" "That's an important question," I replied. "We would have to establish clear boundaries from the beginning. If you ever need genuine financial help, we would have to sit down and talk about it honestly. Discuss if it's really an emergency, if there are other options, and how repayment would be handled if applicable." Fernanda timidly raised her hand. "And if we make mistakes while we're learning? If we fall into old patterns without realizing it?" "Then we'll talk about it," I replied. "But the difference would be that in a new, healthy relationship, when someone points out a problem, the response isn't defensiveness or manipulation. The response is, 'You're right. How can I do better?'" Naomi stood up to pour more coffee. "You know what? I think this conversation is already evidence that real change is possible. 2 hours ago, you were here demanding and threatening. Now you're asking and listening." Mark smiled for the first time all afternoon. "You're right. I feel different, like I'm seeing my mom for the first time in years. And I feel like I'm getting my son back," I replied, feeling a genuine warmth toward him for the first time in a long time. Fernanda cleared her throat. "Evelyn, I know this is going to sound strange after everything that's happened today, but could you tell us about your new apartment? I'd like to know more about this new life you're building." Fernanda's question pleasantly surprised me. It was the first time in years that someone in my family showed genuine curiosity about my personal plans, about my dreams, about what I wanted for my own life. "My new apartment?" I repeated, feeling a genuine smile spread across my face. "You really want to know about it?" "Yes," Mark said, leaning forward with real interest. "I want to know what excites you about this new chapter." I stood up and went to the desk where I had kept all the photos and brochures of the apartment. I had been looking at them almost every night for the past few weeks, planning what my new life would be like. "It's on the 5th floor of a beautiful building near downtown," I began, spreading the photos on the table. "It has 2 bedrooms, one for me and another that I want to turn into an art studio." Fernanda came closer to see the photos. "An art studio? I didn't know you liked art." "There's a lot about me you don't know," I replied, but without bitterness this time. Rather, with a kind of anticipated excitement. "Before I married your father, I used to paint. I was quite good. In fact, I won some local contests when I was in my 20s. Mark picked up one of the photos and studied it carefully. "Mom, you never told me that. Why did you stop painting?" "Because when your father and I got married, he thought painting was a waste of time. He said a wife had more important responsibilities, and then you arrived, and then all the responsibilities of the house, of work, of taking care of everyone." Naomi smiled from her chair. "Tell them about the painting classes you're going to take." "You're going to take classes?" Fernanda asked with genuine surprise in her voice. "Yes," I replied, feeling an excitement I hadn't felt in decades. "There's a community center near the apartment that offers watercolor classes for seniors. They also have a book club, dance classes, and walking groups." Mark seemed to be seeing a completely new person. "Mom, you like to dance?" I laughed, remembering how much I had loved dancing when I was young. "Your father hated dancing. He always said it was ridiculous for people our age, but yes, I love to dance, or I used to. I guess I'm going to find out if I still like it." "And what else are you going to do in your new life?" Fernanda asked, glancing at the apartment photos. "Well," I said, picking up another photo, "this is the view from the living room. See that park? I'm going to walk there every morning. There's a 2-mile trail that goes around a small lake, and on Wednesday mornings there's a farmer's market in the main square." "That sounds beautiful," Mark murmured. "And," I continued, feeling my enthusiasm grow with every detail I shared, "there's an incredible library 3 blocks from the apartment. They have reading events, lectures, and even a creative writing group." Naomi joined the conversation. "Evelyn has always wanted to write her family stories, her memoirs." Fernanda looked up from the photos. "You want to write a book?" "I want to write about the life I've lived, the lessons I've learned, the things I've seen change over the years. I want to write about what it means to be a woman in different eras, about motherhood, about finding your own voice after years of silence." The silence that followed was different from all the previous ones. This one was filled with discovery, with the gradual understanding that the woman in front of them was much more complex and interesting than they had ever imagined. "Mom," Mark finally said, "I had no idea you had all these dreams." "Because you never asked," I replied, but without resentment, and because I too had forgotten that I had them. I got so lost in being the perfect mother, the helpful mother-in-law, the available grandmother, that I forgot I was also Evelyn, a person with her own desires and ambitions. Fernanda placed one of the photos on the table and looked me directly in the eyes. "Evelyn, I want to apologize." "For what specifically?" I asked her, because I needed to know if she truly understood what had been wrong. "For seeing you only as a role in my life, not as a complete person. For assuming you had no needs of your own, no dreams of your own, no life of your own to live." Her words were like a balm to wounds I had been carrying for years. "And I," Mark added, "want to apologize for becoming a stranger to you, for letting months go by without a real conversation, for calling you only when I needed something." Naomi came closer and put a hand on my shoulder. "How do you feel hearing this, Evelyn?" I feel relieved, I admitted. For years I thought that maybe I was the one asking too much, expecting too much. I feel relieved to know I wasn't crazy. Mark stood up and approached cautiously, as if asking permission for something. Mom, can I hug you? Not because I need something, not to get you to change your mind about the house, just because you're my mom, and I love you. The difference in his attitude was so palpable that it moved me to tears. Of course you can hug me. We hugged, and for the first time in years, it felt like a real hug between mother and son, not an automatic or manipulative gesture. When we pulled apart, Fernanda was crying silently. Do you think we could? Do you think we could really start over? I think we can try, I replied. But I need you to understand that starting over means exactly that. We can't pretend the last few years didn't happen, but we can decide to create something completely different from now on. Mark nodded. And the house? What about the sale? The sale is still happening, I replied firmly. That decision doesn't change. I need this space. I need this freedom. I need to prove to myself that I can make important decisions about my own life. I understand, he said, and for the first time, he really seemed to understand. Fernanda came closer to the photos again. When do you move? In 2 weeks, I replied. The apartment comes furnished, so I just need to bring my personal things, my clothes, my books. Would you like us to help you with the move? Mark asked timidly. Not because we have to, but because we'd like to. The question surprised me so much that I didn't know what to answer immediately. Naomi smiled. See, they're already learning to offer instead of just receiving. I'd love for you to help me with the move, I finally said, but only if you truly want to, not out of obligation. We want to, Fernanda said, and her voice sounded different, more sincere, warmer. And afterward, after you're settled, we could come visit you to see your new life, to see your art studio when it's ready. I would really like that, I replied, feeling a cautious but real hope growing in my chest. 3 months later, I was sitting on the terrace of my new apartment with a steaming cup of coffee in my hands and a perfect view of the park where I had started walking every morning. The afternoon sun created golden patterns on the pages of the journal where I had been writing my memoirs, and for the first time in decades, I felt completely at peace with myself. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Through the intercom, I heard Mark's voice. Mom, it's us! Can we come up? Of course, I replied, pressing the button to open the building door. As I waited for them to reach the 5th floor, I reflected on how things had changed in these 3 months. Mark and Fernanda's visits were now completely different. They arrived with flowers, with genuine questions about my day, with real time to talk instead of rushing to get something and leave. When I opened the door, Mark had a small potted plant in his hands, and Fernanda carried a bag that smelled deliciously of homemade food. We brought lunch, Fernanda announced with a genuine smile. I thought we could eat together, and then, if you want, I'd love to see how your art studio is coming along. I brought this plant for your terrace, Mark added. Naomi told me you like plants with red flowers. I was touched that they had spoken to Naomi to find out what I liked, instead of assuming or arriving empty-handed as they used to do. Come in, I told them, feeling genuinely happy to see them. While Fernanda set the table with the food she had brought, Mark stood looking out the window toward the park. Mom, you look different, he said. You look younger, more radiant. I feel different, I replied, serving them fresh lemon water. I feel like myself for the first time in many years. Fernanda approached from the kitchen, wiping her hands with a cloth. Evelyn, I want to tell you something. Last week I went to therapy. The news pleasantly surprised me. Really? Yes, she nodded, sitting on the sofa. After our conversation at the house, I realized I needed help to understand why I had developed those behavior patterns, why I had become so opportunistic. Mark sat next to his wife. I've also been doing a lot of reflecting. I've been thinking about how I grew up seeing that you were always available for everything, and how that made me assume it was normal to expect that from you forever." "And what have you discovered?" I asked, genuinely curious. "That we both had fears," Fernanda admitted. "I was afraid of not being good enough, of not being able to provide for my family, so I clung to the security you represented, and Mark was afraid of disappointing everyone. So it was easier to let you handle the difficult things. But those fears don't justify how we treated you," Mark quickly added. "They just help us understand so we can truly change." I sat in my favorite armchair, the same one I had brought from the previous house, but which now felt completely different in this new space. "I appreciate that you're doing that internal work," I told them, "because a new relationship requires us all to grow, not just to change superficial behaviors." Fernanda nodded. "And I want you to know that I've started working extra shifts at the hospital. Not because we desperately need the money, but because I want us to have our own financial stability. I don't want you to ever again have the worry that we're only coming to see you when we need money." "That means a lot to me," I replied sincerely. Mark got up and walked to the corner where I had set up my art studio. "Mom, these paintings are incredible. I didn't know you had so much talent." I got up to join him. In the last 3 months, I had painted 6 watercolors: landscapes of the park, portraits of Naomi, abstractions of the feelings I had been processing during this transition. "This is my favorite," I told him, pointing to a painting of an old tree with deep roots but new branches sprouting toward the sun. "I painted it thinking about us, about how we can maintain our family roots but grow in new and healthy directions." Fernanda came closer too and studied the painting in silence for a few moments. "It's beautiful, Evelyn, and I perfectly understand the symbolism." "Do you know what else I've been doing?" I asked them, leading them to the desk where I had my writing pages. "I've been writing about our family history, but from a new perspective, writing about the lessons I've learned, about the importance of maintaining one's own identity within family relationships." Mark picked up some pages and read them. "Mom, this is really good. Have you thought about publishing it?" "The writing group at the community center thinks I should try," I admitted. "They say there are many women who could benefit from reading about this experience." "You should do it," Fernanda said with genuine enthusiasm. "Your story could help other families avoid the mistakes we made." We returned to the living room and finally sat down to enjoy the lunch Fernanda had prepared. As we ate, they told me about their own lives in a way they never had before. Mark told me about his frustrations at work, his dreams of perhaps starting his own business someday. Fernanda told me about a promotion she was considering at the hospital, about how she had started taking cooking classes because she wanted to develop a hobby of her own. "And the kids?" I asked. "How are they handling all these changes?" "Surprisingly well," Mark replied. "In fact, Leo told me last week that he likes it more when we visit Grandma now because we all seem happier. Children always perceive family dynamics even when we think we're hiding them," I observed. After lunch, they insisted on washing the dishes while I relaxed on the terrace. Watching them work together in my small kitchen, talking and laughing, filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. When they finished, Fernanda came to sit with me on the terrace while Mark continued exploring my art studio. "Evelyn," she said softly, "I want to thank you." "Thank me for what?" "For not giving up on us. For making the difficult decision to sell the house and force us to confront reality, for giving us the opportunity to truly know you and to become better people." Her words deeply moved me. "Fernanda, what I did wasn't just for you. I did it for me, but I'm so glad it resulted in something good for everyone." Mark joined us on the terrace, bringing 3 cups of coffee he had prepared. "Mom," he said, "I want to ask you something important. Tell me, are you happy? Truly happy?" The question made me smile from the soul. "Yes, son, I am happy. For the first time in many years, I am genuinely happy." "It shows," he told me, sitting in the chair next to me. "And I want you to know that seeing you so happy makes us happy too." As the sun began to set over the park, the three of us sat in comfortable silence, enjoying the present moment. There was no rush, no hidden agenda, no tension, just a family that had learned to relate in a new and healthier way. "You know what?" I finally told them. "Today you didn't ask me if I needed anything, nor did you ask me for any favors, nor did you mention any financial problems." "Because we didn't come for that," Fernanda replied. "We came because we wanted to spend time with you." "And that's how it should always be," Mark added. As they prepared to leave that afternoon, they hugged me with a genuine warmth that reminded me why this new relationship had been worth fighting for. "Can we come next week?" Fernanda asked. "I'd like to bring the kids so they can see your new home." "I'd love that," I replied. "But come because you want to be here, not because you feel you have to." "We want to be here," Mark assured me. "We finally understand the difference." If you enjoyed my story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can write more stories like this. Thanks a lot in advance. What about you? What would you do in this person's shoes? I'd really love to hear your thoughts, so drop them in the comments. I'm always curious to know what you think. Oh, and let me know where you've heard this story. If you want to hear more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many more waiting for you. Big hugs and see you next time.